Hey guys, so this is the beginning of Unit 2, actually it's the end of Unit 1. In fact, two of you have already done the worksheets for this, but this is as far as we kind of got on the last day. So Introduction to Trigonometry. So trig is kind of interesting because for me, it's actually the math I've used the most. It's used in surveying, it's used for measurement, it's used for a lot of the tools that we do to figure out how far things are apart without actually having to go and measure them. And it's based on similar triangles, especially similar right-angle triangles. So since all the angles in a similar triangle are the same, and it's basically the same triangle just pulled out, that means there has to be a relationship between the angles and the sides. So in fact, if you take that ratio, big over small divided by big over small, and rearrange it, you actually find that within the triangle there's a ratio as well. That this side divided by this side is the same as this side divided by that side. So, and in fact, A over C is D over F, because if you flip them, it stays the same. And that's interesting because that's a function called the sine, and that's actually related to this angle for both triangles. That if you hit the sine button on your calculator and plug in that angle, you'll get the same number you would if you divided those ratios. So what trig allows us to do is to connect an angle to a side. So in the real world, if you can't physically measure all three sides, as long as I know one side and an angle, I can actually figure out the other two, which in the real world is actually quite useful. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure we're all talking the same terms. So the hypotenuse is always the longest side, and it's always the side opposite the right angle triangle. So look for where the square is. The side opposite that is always your hypotenuse. By the way, we don't like using full words in math, so feel free to just write hyp, H-Y-P. For the other two sides, it depends on what angle we're looking at. So the opposite would be the one opposite the angle we're looking at. The adjacent would be the one beside the angle we're looking at. So this would be the opposite for this angle, this would be the adjacent for that angle. Adjacent basically means beside. So for example, the first worksheet is labeling the triangles. So easy thing, the hypotenuse, always the side opposite the square, opposite the right angle. The opposite, you got to look at the angle. So for example, H is the hypotenuse for everything. For angle A, side A would be the opposite, side B would be adjacent. The adjacent is the side that's beside, okay? So the adjacent is the one that's beside the angle that's not the hypotenuse. The way to tell, hypotenuse, always the one across from the right angle. Opposite is the side across from your angle. Adjacent is either the last one or it's the one beside your angle that isn't the hypotenuse. So, but keep in mind that's different. So A is the opposite and B is the adjacent for angle A, but B would be the opposite and A would be the adjacent if we were interested in angle B. And which angle are we interested in? Basically, it's the one that's easiest to measure in real life. That's why we want to basically flip it around, so that if we know angle A or angle B, we can still figure out everything else. So, what actually is that ratio? Well, it's something called a trig ratio. So a sine, a cosine, or a tangent, depending on which sides you're taking the ratio of. So the sine ratio is the opposite over the hypotenuse, or again, OPP over HYP. You can shorten them if you want. The cosine is the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, and the tangent is the opposite divided by the adjacent. Notice the opposite is the one that's opposite the angle. The adjacent is the one that's beside the angle. It changes between these two diagrams in the blue one. Now, what is that ratio? And it's always the same for the same angle. It doesn't matter what the length of the sides are. It's actually the angle that tells you what the number is. By the way, it's always going to be a number less than 1. So how do you figure out what the sine, cosine, tangent are? Well, your calculator. Your calculator has a sine, cosine, and tangent button. So nice, all you have to do is you put in the angle, you hit the sine button, and that tells you what the ratio of the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse for that angle would be. Same with cos, same with tangent. Now, there's something that's really important. You need to make sure your calculator is in degree mode, because there are actually 3 ways scientific calculators can enter angles: degree, radian, and gradient. The other 2 you'll only notice if you've done way, way, way too much math in your life, but the buttons have to be there anyway for us. You guys will only ever need degree mode probably. So make sure, however, your calculator is in degree mode, otherwise it doesn't know you're entering angles in degrees, and you'll get totally wrong answers for absolutely everything, and it'll frustrate the heck out of you. I've had students in grade 12 write an entire exam with a calculator in the wrong mode and get every answer on the question wrong, on the exam wrong, because that just were completely frustrated. So make sure your calculator is in degree mode before you start. Other than that, it's easy. You want to know the sine of 30? You put 30 into your calculator, hit sine. Or if you have one of the programmables, you hit sine and then 30. You're going to have to figure that out for your own calculator, because it's one way or the other. If you've got an old calculator like this, you put in 30 and hit sine. If you've got a new one, and if you hit the word sine, you see sine in a bracket, that means you have to put the 30 after. But you'll all get the same answers. Put 30 in, hit sine, 0.5. 30 in, hit cos, 0.87. 30 in, hit tangent, 0.58. By the way, you're going to get like a whole string of numbers. I don't need you to write them all. Just round it to the nearest second decimal place, okay? So just give me 2 decimal places, round it up or round it down depending on which one it is. So that's what I want you to do first. One worksheet, label the sides, practice labeling the sides of a triangle so you can do it really fast without thinking. And one, literally just plugging the number into your calculator, hitting the sine button or the cosine or the tangent button, and writing down what decimal you get. All right? On Wednesday, we're going to talk about how can we actually use sine, cosine, and tangent functions to do some neat things. All right. Bye-bye.